September 1945. Somewhere in the Pacific. The war was over, but for hundreds of Japanese military personnel now in American custody, a different kind of battle was just beginning. They had been taught that capture meant torture and death. They had been told American soldiers were demons without honor. They expected cruelty. What they received instead would shatter everything they believed about enemies, about war, and about the nation they had served. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, hit that subscribe button and drop your location in the comments. These true stories from World War II reveal the power of humanity even in history's darkest hours. Let's dive in. The propaganda had been relentless. For years, Japanese soldiers and support personnel had been told the same message. Americans were monsters. Surrender would bring humiliation worse than death. Better to die fighting than face what awaited in enemy hands. The Imperial Army's training manual was explicit: capture was the ultimate dishonor. But as Japan collapsed in August 1945, thousands found themselves with no choice. The empire had fallen. Resistance was futile, and now they stood on the decks of American ships, sailing toward an unknown fate. Among them were nurses who had treated wounded soldiers across the Pacific, radio operators who had intercepted American communications, clerks and translators who had worked in occupied territories. Most were young, between 18 and 30. All were terrified. They clutched whatever possessions they had salvaged: a photograph, a letter, a small bag of belongings. Some had nothing at all. They stood in clusters, not speaking, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. The journey was unlike anything they expected. American sailors moved among them, not with rifles and threats, but with canteens of water, with blankets when the nights turned cold. The food was simple but regular: rice, bread, canned vegetables. After months or years of diminishing rations and a collapsing empire, even basic food felt surreal. One young woman, a former nurse named Keiko, watched an American sailor hand out chocolate bars to children among the prisoners. She couldn't understand it. Why would the enemy feed them? Why show any kindness at all? When they reached American processing centers, some in Guam, others in Okinawa, still others bound for the continental United States, the contrast became impossible to ignore. They were given medical examinations, not rough interrogations, but actual health care. Doctors checked for malnutrition, disease, untreated wounds. Nurses, American women in crisp white uniforms, moved among them with professional care that showed no hatred, no contempt, just efficiency and occasionally sympathy. The showers came next. For many, it was the first hot water they had felt in years. The Imperial Army had provided minimal facilities for its personnel, especially women. Field hospitals and support stations rarely had proper bathing areas. But here, in enemy captivity, hot water poured from working shower heads. Soap was provided: real soap that smelled of flowers, not the harsh lye bars they had known. Some women cried as they washed. Others stood in silence, unable to process the dissonance between expectation and reality. Clean clothes followed. Simple gray dresses for the women, standard issue uniforms for the men. Nothing fancy, but clean and whole. No tears, no patches. After years of wearing the same worn uniforms, of stitching repairs until fabric fell apart, this basic dignity felt overwhelming. A young radio operator named Hiroko held her new dress and thought of her family in Tokyo. She had received letters before surrender. Her mother described boiling tree bark to make soup. Her younger siblings wore clothes made from old curtains. And here she stood, a prisoner, wearing clean new fabric. The food was what broke them, not physically, but psychologically. The mess halls served regular meals: breakfast, lunch, dinner. The portions were substantial: bread with butter, eggs and bacon, rice and vegetables, meat at nearly every meal. For people who had watched their rations shrink month by month as Japan's supply lines collapsed, this abundance was incomprehensible. One meal here contained more protein than they had eaten in weeks back home. Keiko sat at a long table, staring at her plate. Roast chicken with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread, fresh milk. Her hands shook as she picked up her fork. Around her, other women were crying as they ate, not from joy, but from a confusion so deep it felt like grief. They were prisoners of war, yet they were eating better than they ever had as free citizens of the empire. What did that mean? What did it say about the nation they had served? The American soldiers watched this with expressions that ranged from sympathy to bewilderment. Most of these young men had fought brutal battles across the Pacific. They had lost friends to Japanese bullets and bombs. Yet here they were, serving meals to former enemies, following orders that treated captivity as a matter of international law, not personal vengeance. One sergeant named Miller told another, "They look like they've never seen real food before." His companion shrugged. "Maybe they haven't." The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established rules for prisoner treatment. The United States, having ratified the agreement, followed its provisions. Japan had signed but never ratified the convention, and its treatment of POWs had been notoriously brutal. Now that the war had ended, the contrast became starkly visible. American camps provided adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from abuse. Japanese camps had provided starvation, disease, forced labor, and systematic cruelty. This wasn't propaganda. This was observable reality. And for the Japanese prisoners experiencing it firsthand, the cognitive dissonance was devastating. They had been taught that Americans were racists who viewed Japanese as subhuman. Yet the guards treated them with neutral professionalism. They had been told Americans were savage and without honor. Yet the camp commanders enforced rules that protected prisoner dignity and rights. Every day of decent treatment was another crack in the ideological foundation they had been raised on. The small kindnesses were somehow the most powerful. An American soldier helping a woman carry a heavy box. A nurse who smiled and squeezed a frightened patient's shoulder. A guard who waved casually instead of glaring with hatred. These gestures didn't match the propaganda. They revealed something the imperial government had never acknowledged, that the enemy saw them as human beings, not as objects to be used and discarded. Hiroko worked in a camp laundry, operating machines that did most of the heavy work. She had expected brutal labor, the kind that broke bodies and spirits. Instead, she worked 8-hour shifts with breaks. The American supervisor, a woman named Sarah, taught her how to use the equipment and occasionally brought extra sandwiches from the mess hall. "You're too thin," Sarah would say through a translator. "You need to eat more." Hiroko didn't know how to respond. Was this kindness real? Or was it manipulation, a way to make prisoners compliant? But if it was manipulation, what was the purpose? The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. There was nothing left to extract from prisoners except basic cooperation, which the Americans already had. The kindness served no tactical purpose. It seemed to exist simply because this was how Americans believed prisoners should be treated. That realization was more devastating than any cruelty could have been, because it meant everything they had been told was a lie. The propaganda about American demons and monsters lies. The claims that surrender meant torture lies. The assertion that dying was preferable to capture a lie that had cost countless lives. And if those were lies, what else had been false? What had they sacrificed for? What had their families suffered for? The questions had no good answers. Letters from home made it worse. When mail service was established, prisoners could write to their families and receive replies. The letters from Japan painted a picture of utter devastation. Cities in ruins, hunger everywhere, disease spreading through refugee camps. Keiko's mother wrote about eating sweet potato leaves and dandelion roots. Hiroko's father described sleeping in a shelter made from scrap metal because their house had burned in the firebombing. Another woman received news that her brother had died of starvation after the surrender, and here they sat, gaining weight, their cheeks filling out, their strength returning. They looked healthier as prisoners than they ever had as free citizens of Imperial Japan. The guilt was crushing. How could they accept this food, this comfort, this care, while their families starved? Yet refusing it changed nothing. The food would still be there, the Americans would still offer it, and their bodies, after years of deprivation, couldn't resist. Some prisoners tried to maintain their resistance. They refused to learn English. They kept to themselves, avoiding unnecessary interaction with guards. They ate the food but took no pleasure in it, treating meals as fuel rather than nourishment. These holdouts insisted that acceptance of kindness was betrayal, that gratitude toward the enemy was dishonor. But even among these diehards, doubt crept in, because the evidence was everywhere. The enemy was treating them with a humanity their own government never had. The philosophical implications were staggering. Democracy, which they had been taught was weak and corrupt, had produced a system that valued individual human dignity even in wartime. The emperor-centered ideology that demanded absolute sacrifice had produced a system that consumed its own people like fuel. One system saw humans as individuals worthy of basic rights. The other saw humans as tools of the state. The results spoke for themselves. By late 1945, as preparations began for repatriation, many prisoners faced an unexpected crisis. They were going home, back to their families and their country. This should have brought joy. Instead, it brought dread. What would they find in Japan? How would they explain that they looked healthy while their families starved? How could they describe the kindness of their captors without sounding like traitors? Some asked if they could stay in America. The answer was always no. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. They had to go back. But the asking itself revealed how completely their worldview had shifted. These were people who had been willing to die for Japan 6 months earlier. Now they were begging to remain with their former enemies rather than return to their homeland. The transformation was complete. When the ships finally departed for Japan, carrying repatriated prisoners home, many stood at the rails with tears streaming down their faces. Some were crying from joy at seeing their families again. Others were crying because they were leaving a place where they had been treated better than their own country had ever treated them. The contradictions were impossible to resolve. They arrived in a Japan that barely resembled the nation they had left. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure was destroyed. Millions were homeless and starving. The emperor, once portrayed as divine, had announced Japan's surrender in a human voice on the radio. The entire ideological structure that had justified the war had collapsed. And into this devastation came prisoners who looked well-fed and healthy because the enemy had fed them. The reception was complicated. Families were grateful their loved ones had survived. But there was also suspicion, even resentment. You were eating well while we starved. You were safe while we died. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. Some returnees tried to explain. We were prisoners. We had no choice. But the explanations felt hollow because the underlying truth was more complex. They had come to see their captors not as demons, but as human beings. And that revelation had changed them forever. Keiko returned to what remained of her family's home in Osaka. The neighborhood was a wasteland of burned buildings and empty lots. Her mother had aged 20 years. Her younger brother was skeletal, his eyes too large in his thin face. When they saw her healthy, strong, clearly well-fed, their first expressions were joy. But the joy quickly turned to confusion, then to something that looked like accusation. Her mother asked, carefully, "The Americans treated you well?" Keiko nodded, unable to speak. Her mother looked away. "We heard they were monsters." That sentence contained everything: the propaganda, the lies, the realization that their suffering had been unnecessary and avoidable. If Japan had surrendered earlier, if the military leadership had accepted reality instead of demanding suicidal resistance, how many lives could have been saved? The war crimes trials beginning in Tokyo would address legal accountability. But the moral reckoning was something each person had to face individually. Hiroko never spoke publicly about her time as a prisoner. The shame was too deep, the contradictions too painful. But privately, in conversations with her daughter years later, she tried to explain what she had learned. The enemy wasn't what they told us. They were capable of terrible things, the bombs, the destruction. But they were also capable of mercy. And that mercy revealed the truth about our own leaders. They had lied to us about everything. The broader historical truth was undeniable. During the war, Japan held approximately 350,000 Allied prisoners. Of these, about 27% died in captivity from starvation, disease, overwork, and deliberate execution. The United States held approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners, primarily German and Italian, but also Japanese. The death rate among POWs in American custody was less than 1%. The difference wasn't subtle. It was a gulf between two entirely different philosophical approaches to warfare and human value. This wasn't about one side being completely good and the other completely evil. War is too complex for such simple categories. American forces committed atrocities in the Pacific Theater. Strategic bombing killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. The atomic bombs incinerated entire cities. But in the specific arena of prisoner treatment, the contrast was stark and measurable. One system followed international law and treated captives as human beings entitled to basic dignity. The other system treated captives as expendable resources, tools to be used and discarded. For the Japanese prisoners who experienced both systems, first serving an empire that saw them as expendable, then becoming captives of a democracy that saw them as individuals, the lesson was profound and unforgettable. They learned that the enemy could show mercy, that dignity didn't require cruelty, that human rights could transcend national boundaries. These lessons, purchased at the cost of everything they once believed, would shape post-war Japan in ways large and small. Some, like Keiko, became nurses and healthcare workers, inspired by the professional care they had witnessed in American camps. Others, like Hiroko, simply tried to live quietly, carrying their experiences as private knowledge. A few married American servicemen during the occupation and emigrated, choosing to build new lives with former enemies, rather than remain in a homeland that felt alien. Most raised children and grandchildren in rebuilt Japan, passing on subtle lessons about questioning authority and recognizing propaganda. The historical irony was profound. Japan had taught its people that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that death was preferable to captivity. Yet the prisoners who survived to experience American captivity discovered something that the dead never could, that their own leaders had lied to them, that the enemy was not what propaganda claimed, that sometimes the hardest truth to accept is kindness from those you expected to hate you. This wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. It was a story about two systems, one that saw humans as individuals with inherent rights, and one that saw humans as tools of the state. When those systems collided in the Pacific War, the difference became impossible to ignore. Japanese prisoners ate chocolate and roast chicken in American camps while their families starved at home. They slept in beds with clean sheets while civilians picked through rubble. They received medical care while epidemics swept through Japan's rooms. The question that haunted them forever was simple and unanswerable. Why? Why did the enemy treat us better than our own government? Why were we told they were monsters when they acted with more humanity than our leaders? The answer, when it came, was devastating, because everything we believed was a lie. Every sacrifice we made was for a system that never valued us as human beings, and the proof was in the simple fact that we looked healthier in enemy captivity than we ever did serving our own country. That truth, painful, undeniable, transformative, was the real weapon America deployed. Not bullets or bombs, but the simple demonstration that another way was possible. That power didn't require cruelty. That victory didn't demand vengeance. That even an enemy could be treated with dignity. For the Japanese prisoners who saw this firsthand, it was more devastating than any battlefield defeat, because it meant their worldview had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Decades later, in the 1970s, a group of former prisoners met for the first time since the war. In a small Tokyo restaurant, gray-haired now, they eventually spoke about their months in American custody. One woman said quietly, "I've never told anyone this, but I was happier as a prisoner than I ever was serving the Empire." The others nodded. They understood. They had carried the same secret shame, the truth that kindness from the enemy had shattered everything they thought. They knew about loyalty and honor. That was a real story. Not heroes and villains, but a complicated truth about how humans treat each other in wartime, how propaganda shapes perception until reality forces a reckoning, how the most devastating weapon can be mercy, not violence. Cruelty hardens resistance, but unexpected kindness destroys the foundations of hatred. If this made you think, subscribe and hit the notification bell. History's uncomfortable truths matter, because even in darkness, choices remain between cruelty and mercy, propaganda and truth. Leave a comment with your thoughts.